We have Dr. Brooks and Dr. Miller with us. So thank you so much for joining us after this talk. And it was really great to hear. And yeah, would you like to maybe maybe speak up real quick before we have the Q&A?
Well, I want to say hello to everybody. I've been to Michigan State several times. So my name is Rice, and I'm very glad to be with you. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee tonight, my home. So miss being there in person, but thank you for joining us. And whoever's watching, we hope we can answer your questions or at least give it a good shot. And that's my buddy, Dr. Miller. Go ahead, Dr. Miller.
Hi, I'm Brian Miller. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to talking with you about the material you watched in the video. And I'm in Seattle, Washington.
And then we have Addison Tweedy, who is our coordinator there with the bald head. Very proud of that hairdo. So Addison, thank you for your help. All right, Veronica.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, so how about we start off with a couple of questions that were being asked during the beginning of the talk, which has to do with the beginning. So one of our questions was from a listener named Bob, who was wondering, how can a God have always existed?
Well, that's the age-old question. I feel like Rhett and Link here on Good Mythical Morning. We're going to answer the age-old question. I'm not a scientist, I'm a theologian, so I'm going to start this out, and I'm going to let you, as a physicist, Brian, kind of pick this up and give the, more of the view from your side of the aisle, so to speak. But really, when you start thinking about it philosophically, there has to be a brute fact. So you either have material world, which materialism, physical things are the cause of everything. So at some point, you would have to have a self-existent or a always been there brute fact that's physical. And when we say that the beginning of the universe, that there was something before the beginning, so to speak, or there was a cause of the beginning, being a spaceless, timeless, uncaused, personal, and powerful. Personal meaning that for the state of the universe, or for you go to nothing to something, that there had to be an agent involved. And so that's volitional, that's will. So I think you're dealing with the fact that either way you look at it, whether how can there always be a God, or how could there always be a quark, how could there always be a God, or as Dr. Hawking, the late Dr. Hawking said, because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing, which again, as we pointed out, is a philosophical contradiction. That you're either positing an eternal law or an eternal lawgiver. So Dr. Miller, your shot at that.
Yeah, and what you have to realize is everyone believes that something just always existed. So for people that are Christian, or they believe in a God who's always existed, that's infinitely powerful and personal. But if you're an atheist, you have to believe that there's some physical laws that have just always existed. And if you look at attempts to explain the fine-tuning of the laws of physics, what's happened is many people argue that there is basically an infinite number of universes where everything is possible. So again, both groups are appealing to something that's always been there and something that is infinite in its expanse.
And if we were live, I'd be looking at you going, does that help? And you'd be going, uh-huh, or uh-huh, like this. So I don't know if there's a response on that, Veronica, but the question of, it's like if you're walking through I know I don't want to downplay this or be trivial with it, but if you're walking through the woods and you see a turtle on a fence post, one thing you would know is that it didn't get there by itself. So something, the universe being existent, and that's why the question offered by Gottfried Leibniz, the co-founder of differential calculus, said, why is there something rather than nothing? So we have a universe, it's ordered. We have conscious beings like us that are here, being able to observe it. And so to say to ourselves, as C.S. Lewis would have said, was it more logical that matter, physical, produced mind, or was it more logical that mind produced matter? And I know, Brian, when you get into this, this is maybe a little bit off, but I think it fits in here, because when you're dealing in the idea of just the laws of physics and what happens at the proverbial collapse of the wave function. In other words, we're starting to realize, or there's been people like me, but the physicists have known that this presence of an observer actually has an effect on the physical world. Do you want to expound on that? If you think I'm taking us off into a detour, you can stop me.
Sure. So what that sort of alludes to is what's called quantum cosmology. And if you look at attempts to explain the start of the universe, if you go to people like Stephen Hawking, people like Alexander Vilenkin, who's quoted by Lawrence Krauss, is what you find is people realized that the earliest parts of our universe, at least our known universe, was like a quantum state. And what happens is a quantum system has many different possibilities. And what happens is that what actually takes place is determined by an observer. It's determined by like a physical apparatus that measures something. But before the universe existed, there was nothing physical. So the only observer, the only person that could cause a state to come into existence, a universe to come into existence, has to be a mind that's outside of the physical universe. So again, what we see is the physical appears to have come into being from a mind based on everything that was talked about in the lecture.
Thank you. So this is also kind of related, still talking about physics, but we had someone named Joe ask us a question too, saying like, and it's just, like I said, it was related, are the laws of physics a manifestation of God?
What happens is, at least within the Christian framework, there's the understanding that God is beyond the physical universe. So if the physical universe did not exist, God would not be less. God is still self-existent, fully powerful, even before he created the universe. So what happened is God created the universe. He created the universe to operate according to laws, according to principles. So those laws are a manifestation of God's creative power, but God and the universe are separate.
Right.
But I would, from a theological standpoint, the book of Romans says that we can see the nature of God and the attributes through what has been made. So it's like the Bible basically says you don't necessarily need the Bible to know there's a God. So when people say, oh, you just believe in God because the book tells you, no, the book tells us that without the book, you can look and see through reason and observation that there is an order to the universe that could not have happened basically by chance. And the Bible doesn't say it in those words, but it says the nature and attributes of God are clearly seen through what has been made. So I think when you look at the laws of physics and what we talk about is the fine tuning, and I don't know how many of the questions below us here are going to deal with this, but when people are asking for evidence for God, they kind of brush past these two things, the beginning of the universe and the fine tuning of the universe, which are massively needed. They massively scream out for an explanation. I mean, again, the fact that you can take these laws, these constants and these quantities of gravity, entropy, and all the others that are there a fraction of a second. When I mean fraction, Dr. Miller can give you the exact, how minute this is. Moments, just fractions of a second after the beginning of the universe. These laws of physics not only come into existence, but they're calibrated. And that points to the order. And not only is there physical order, but we know as humans that there's this moral law within us. And this is what we get into when we talk about the issue of good and evil, that we are people that cry out for justice when we see something that happened to George Floyd or any of the situations that have elicited this sense of injustice and what can be done. And this is wrong. Whenever we cry out that something is wrong, we're appealing to a moral law that we did not invent. And as C.S. Lewis would say, nor can we escape from. In other words, there is just as real as there's physical laws, there are moral laws. And I think this again points to the nature and attributes of the kind of God we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a force. We're not dealing with this impersonal force that's just out there that if we feel good one day and we want to kind of say thanks to the universe, well, the universe helped me out. No, the universe didn't help you out, but the God who created the universe is ready, and he's willing to answer our prayers, to listen to us. And I think this is the hope that the Christian worldview and that the reality that God's not dead, it provides for us.
Yeah. Well, I hope you don't mind if I also kind of insert something too, because I'm a PhD student at Michigan State, and I do a lot of statistics, and I'm always fascinated at like how, like we can actually have a lot of noise, but still be able to make predictions from it. And those patterns are just fascinating to me, that we have these, we can, it's like, statistical inference is what we call it. I don't know if Dr. Miller, you have any kind of like talk about that, if that's like related to this idea of design is like our ability to make predictions, and in the whole scientific method, if it's related. But I mean, I really love this physics question because it relates to me personally.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. And mathematics is, in fact, there was a famous quote. I think Addison might remember the author, is the unreasonable usefulness of mathematics. Famous mathematician said that it's
Wigner. I'm not a mathematician, but I remember that. I think
good for you. And what happens is it's really weird that we can do science, because if the laws of physics were just there by chance, then there's no reason that we would have the mental capacity to understand them and use them. But the fact that the laws follow these very simple mathematical structures that physicists can grapple with and understand is absolutely extraordinary. That our universe wasn't simply designed for us to live, but for us to be able to understand it and study it. So that's a really, very insightful comment.
I think, let me just jump ahead, because again, if we were having interaction here, I would anticipate somebody saying, well, that doesn't prove the Christian God. You can't go from the beginning of the universe and the fine tuning of the universe to Jesus. And I will agree with you. Dr. Miller will agree with you. But yet this is if you're dealing on a logical path, the first thing you have to say and ask is there something beyond the physical? Because if there's something beyond the natural world, and that's what I believe philosophically it points to, that nature is not all there is. And so if you're now beyond nature, you're beyond physics or metaphysical, you're into the metaphysical, into the philosophical. Now you're into this question of something is there. Now, what is this something? What is this God? Is it an impersonal God? Is it a personal God? Is it this version, or what about all these religions? And so that's why, as we start with the question of is God dead, and that God's not dead, we claim, then we will walk, as we did in the presentation, through the reasons why we believe that the God of the universe that created the universe is the Christian God. But I just want to go ahead and concede the fact that just because we believe there's something that exists beyond nature does not necessarily follow that that's the Christian God. Somebody would have probably asked that, and so I'm going to just say, whoever you are, I spoke for you.
Yeah, and I mean, I actually we do have a lot of questions as well, and I want to try to, I do want to try to incorporate who I can, and so just kind of just to try to wrap up with the topic about just like, the start and the origins, if you don't mind. I guess we can kind of, well, yeah, so we had a question from Fernando, and it's kind of like two questions at once, but, can we think or assume that dark matter is the tangible manifestation of God? And then like a follow-up question is, based on the Bible and that we are the utmost creation of God, what could be a reason for making an extremely large universe? So I don't know, dark matter and a large universe are kind of mixed, but but yeah.
Go ahead. You just take them both, and then I'll get some crumbs that you may have missed.
Okay. So for people that may not know what dark matter is, physicists have recognized that if you look at, let's say, a spiral galaxy, and you look at the dimensions of it, how fast it's rotating, there seems to be about 90% of the matter that's missing. Like matter that's normal matter would be like the normal atoms and electrons that we know about, which you can observe through a telescope through how they interact with radiation. Dark matter is a matter that seems to be there, but is undetectable. And people have argued that it's some sort of matter that's significantly different from what we're aware of. Now, in reality, dark matter and matter are really the same thing. You're just dealing with something that God has created. God created the material universe. God acts within the material universe. So dark matter, just like normal matter, is not the same thing as God, but it's a reflection of God's creation. Now, the question of the size of the universe, what's really interesting is that the fact that our universe is so large means that we can study it and understand how our universe developed over billions of years. Because when you look at the furthest stars, the light we're seeing from those stars left those stars billions of years ago. So the fact that the universe is so large means that we can actually understand how God created it and how it developed with time. And a lot of it's just for us to see the glory of God's creation. Like if Bill Gates bought, let's say, Arizona, he wouldn't try to live every place in Arizona. He'd probably build a mansion somewhere in the middle, but then he would just enjoy the scenery. The same thing is true with our universe.
Brian, you're like an ice skater. You stop right in the middle of a sentence. I'm always waiting for you to go on. You just stop abruptly like that. So let me prod you a little bit anymore, because that's such a good thought of why the universe has to be this big. The number one, I do think theologically it shows that, the mindset that somehow we were in this little, that the solar system would have been the extent of the universe. But over the last, few decades, to really through the Hubble telescope to see the expansiveness, to see, what's the latest estimate, 96 billion light years across. And not only is the universe expanding at the speed of light, but it's like it's also the space itself is expanding, not just the light expanding. And so I think from the physical, just sheer amazing, how big a God is, just to get a glimpse of that. But also there's so many things. I'm thinking of Hugh Ross and why he talks about why the universe has to be the way it is, for the number of stars, for all of the elements that are formed. Any other thing on that you could kind of bring out as a physicist?
Yeah. So if you look at the creation of the universe, you look at, let's say, the Big Bang, and as the universe expanded, to get a universe that could support life, a lot of different parameters have to be right. You've got to have the right mass density at the early part of the universe. If it was like 1 part in 10 to the 24 different, either it would be a diffuse soup of hydrogen atoms or a bunch of black holes. So part of just what's intrinsic into the structure of our universe, it has to be a certain size for it to function properly. So that's definitely an aspect of this sort of fine-tuning the universe for it to support life.
And I have a very layman's Amazon Prime analogy, but and I get a very valuable package, and I open that package up. I go through layers of plastic peanuts, bubble wrap, all to get down to this fragile thing. And I ponder that sometimes, thinking that within this massive expanse of a universe, to have something as different as life, to have this, as Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan called it, the pale blue dot, to have this teardrop in a sea of, just darkness and silence, so to speak, and yet to have this little blip of life. There are things that I guess God, in my imagination, as I ponder and listen to guys like you, Dr. Miller, or others, I always come back to the simple sense of, there was something about the value of life, the unlikelihood of life, that required it to have this kind of packaging. And yet again, it shows, as we maybe move into the next segment on life itself, the anomaly, the amazing thing that life exists at all. I probably thought that was more profound than it came out. That was awesome. Packages coming in my house that are wrapped, and by the time I get down to it, it's something very small. But the more valuable it is, the more packing and wrapping around it. So,
well, actually, Rice, what you're saying, I think it, and also Dr. Miller, I think that it actually prompted another question And this is our last one for this one thing about origins, but just asking about how old the earth is and how does that relate to the Bible and what the Bible says. And we got that from Genival and Sherry. They were both kind of wondering this as they were listening just now.
What happens within the Christian community is there's Christians of very of good conscience that would argue the earth is younger, like 6,000 years, created in a literal 6 days. And then other Christians, such as myself, would argue that the days don't necessarily represent literal days. They could represent epochs or things like that. So that it's consistent with the Christian faith to believe in an ancient universe and an ancient earth. And when you look at the scientific evidence, the scientific community has presented some very compelling evidence that the universe is about 13.7 billion years old through various methods. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, plus or minus. So again, that's something Christians can thoughtfully disagree about. The weight of the evidence does seem for it to be old, although the young earth community wants to try to interpret it differently, but that's kind of where things are at the moment. So we can have nice conversations about that.
And what I say to Christians is that, obviously I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, is that I have never met an atheist in my life that believed that the earth was young. So what I want to do is look at the same evidence. There's not like Christian facts and skeptical facts. We just have the physical universe. We just facts are facts. So we look, we're living in the same world. We're breathing the same air. We're inhabiting the same space. So let's look at what is common ground for all of us and say, what does those facts point to? Does it point to a physical explanation for the universe or something beyond the physical? And that's why we say there's something beyond the physical, that the physical isn't enough, that nature is not all there is. And then we go from there to say, well, here's the Bible. I think there's less than, if you take Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, I'm off the top of my head, I'm thinking you have less than 60 verses that are dealing with the beginning of the universe. So look at what Genesis says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. So that's a summarizing statement. So that doesn't, there's no time requirement of, if you're going to believe this book, you have to believe it's this old. No, it just says in the beginning. Now, as we said in the seminar, up until Einstein, from Aristotle to Einstein, they thought the scientific community at large would have said the universe was just self-existent. It was always there. So the fact that there was a beginning was revolutionary. So here's this book saying there was a beginning. Okay. And then it begins to have a sequence of statements. And God said, let there be. And God said, and God said. So this is obviously a poetic expression within 2 short chapters, giving us an explanation that the universe began, life began, and then brings us into the origins of humanity and the dignity and the uniqueness of humanity. That we're not just, there is a difference between us and the dog besides where our dish is located in the kitchen. There is we have a moral capacity, not that we don't respect life and respect animals and all that, but yet we know that there's something about human evil that is different than animal evil, that animals act by instinct, that we have moral choices that we're making. And I think that when you look at what Genesis is telling us, it's amazing how we miss the big things to kind of get into is it literal 6 days? And I think we're importing a literalistic. I would tell people, I believe the Bible literally, but the Bible uses a lot of different expressions. It uses hyperbole, it uses symbolism, it uses allegory. I mean, when Jesus said to Jerusalem, I would have gathered you under my wings as a hen gathers her chicks. I mean, Jesus wasn't a chicken. He's using a figure of speech. There's hyperbole. If all the books in the world were written, we couldn't have told the story. I mean, God, or phenomenological language, the Bible talks about the sun rising. Now, that's obviously not something that's technically, literalistic. Is the Bible believe that somehow the earth is the center of the universe? No, that's not what it's teaching. So I think that when we look at what the Bible gives us, it's pretty phenomenal, the truths and the answers it gives us within a very short period of time. And I think the evidence of what we can see from science and what all of us can look at points to that there is something beyond nature, and that God exists. And as we get on in these Q&A, as we talked in the presentation, that the Christian God is the real God.
Thanks so much. All right. Well, these next questions, we had one that was specifically for Dr. Miller, but just can you explain in more depth what Dr. Miller was saying about origins and thermodynamics? I didn't quite understand. And I think it's actually kind of related to the follow-up question of, is it possible that God evolved us, or are we a special creation? I think that this is origins and thermodynamics are, it's all kind of related.
Okay, sure. What happens is if you think about the early Earth and the chemicals that were on the early Earth, things like methane, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, those different molecules, what happens is natural processes will tend to go from order to disorder. If you ever tried to keep your room neat, it's much harder to keep it neat than to keep it messy. It just sort of naturally goes from neat to messy. And an exception to that would be like when water freezes. So you have liquid water that becomes ice, and ice is more ordered, but that works because ice, that freezing process, gives off heat into the universe. So the tendency is also to go from high energy to low energy. Water molecules attract each other. The hard part with life is that you have a system which is incredibly highly ordered, and it's very energetic. The chemical bonds have high energy. So it's a physical impossibility for a system to both go to high order, like going from a messy room to a neat room spontaneously, and to high energy, to absorb heat from the environment, because that would cause the entropy of the universe to increase, which is a physical, or decrease, which is a physical impossibility. At a more simple term, make it very simple. If you have a cell and a cell dies, it decomposes back into simple chemicals. What you'll never see is simple chemicals coalesce into a living cell. That's not what happens. So what you see is very clear evidence, not just of a God who created the universe, but a God who shaped life, that life is not an accident, but it demonstrates sort of the breath of God shaping matter into a cell. So you have a God that's both transcendent, outside of time and space, and a God who's involved in the world. And that brings you pretty close to the Christian faith, which is encouraging. Oh, and in terms of evolution, yeah, God could have directed an evolutionary process, and groups like BioLogos talk about that, how evolution and Christianity can work together. But what you'd find is evolution wouldn't happen within an atheistic worldview. There's many, many reasons which that wouldn't work. And that's something that's a bit beyond the scope of this talk, but you can email me if you have more questions about that.
I'm sorry, on mute. This is Zoom. But anyway, so on the top right-hand side, we do have, like if you want to connect with us, if you have more questions, we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I mean, these our lovely hosts are available to speak with us as well. So yeah, thank you so much for also being willing to connect. Okay, so Dr.
Let
Brooks,
me say something real quick, Veronica. Can I butt in? Normally when we come to campus, I give every student a free book. So this is the book, God's Not Dead. And one of the deals with my publisher, I said, I don't want to sell these to college students. I want to give them out. So we've been privileged to give out thousands of these in many different languages. So we've got, here's Polish, here's Chinese. And then here's one of my favorites. This is just a few I picked up before I went out here. This is Icelandic. And I think we mentioned in the seminar about the book being published in Icelandic. And if you Google atheism in Iceland, it talked about how in 2016 that nobody under 25 believes in God. So we've been 3 times there to Reykjavik. It's been a wonderful time giving students these books. So we have a free book. So Veronica, how can they get the free book? Normally I would just hand it to them as they left, but how can they do that here if they connect with you? We just want to get the book. So if you'd like one, it's free. We'll get it to you. So you tell them how.
Yeah, I also have a book too from the last time that Dr. Brooks came to visit, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And that's how I got involved with all of this. I was actually a person who was just in the audience, and now I'm on YouTube. And I get a chance to. I had more questions. And so and that's what's great about Every Nation and the God's Not Dead. It's a movement. It really is recognizing that there is evidence for God, and that evidence leads to Jesus, which is amazing as well. But if you'd like a free book, just connect on the right-hand side, as I said, and put in the comment, I want a free book. And if there's a language you prefer as well, I think we have Espanol, right? So like,
Portuguese, it's the most languages people would speak.
Yeah, so just let us know if something like that too. But this book, especially, it's a really awesome gift, and thank you so much for offering that to us. So please get in touch. But yeah, so Dr. Brooks, do you have any like kind of follow up from what Dr. Miller said, or would you like for me to move forward with other questions?
Let's just try to get through some more questions. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Yeah, cool. So the next topic, just kind of following from what we heard from your talk, they're just really asking about why is there so much suffering in the world? I mean, I'm sure you guys watch the news. I think that's on everybody's minds. So would you like to just tell us a little more about what you think?
Start, Dr. Miller. You have great thoughts on this.
What's really interesting is, again, as I mentioned before, if you look at the fine tuning of the laws of physics, you see this evidence of a God outside of time and space that created our universe. If you look at the origin of life, you look at this incredible nanotechnology, machine beyond our wildest imagination in terms of complexity and ingenuity, it shows a God who's involved in the world. So the question then becomes, if God is so all-powerful, why is the world such a mess? Why is there evil? Why is there suffering? And that really is best explained by the Christian faith, because Christians believe that God created the world as good, that people were created to be in a relationship with God where he gave them a sense of purpose, a sense of perfect love, a sense of security. But people had the choice to either follow God or to basically turn away from God and say, I'll be my own God, I'll make my own rules. And people did that. So people turned from God, from good to evil. And it was that free choice that they were given that people turned from God. And that's what resulted in the evil and suffering in the world. That's what broke our relationship with nature, our relationship with each other, our relationship with our Creator. It's kind of like if you have a plant and the plant is getting nutrients from the soil. If you cut the roots off the plant dies. We're designed to be in relationship with an infinite Creator that loves us. When we turn from God, there's a hole in our soul that results in the insecurity, the fear, and then ultimately into the cruelty and suffering that we see today.
Yeah, so, for 40 years, I've been a pastor and worked not only in a location, let's say here for the last 15 or 20 years, actually 20 years now in Nashville, but just traveling the world, 40 countries, talking to students and answering this very question over and over again. And the first thing I want to know when I'm talking to someone is this a personal, like, what have you encountered that is devastating? What suffering are you talking about? There's a theoretical suffering of why is there suffering in the world? And there's this existential crisis of your own pain. So I don't like to rush past this and just jump to a nice little answer, because so many of you have experienced pain. Then I find myself, I kind of run to the storm. After 9/11, almost 20 years ago, I drove from Nashville to New York City and got there 2 days after 9/11 and just walked the streets to pray with people and felt that we were to begin a congregation there. And I came back to Nashville on the Sunday after 9/11 and I said, I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to start a congregation in Manhattan. And a man came out of the crowd. His name is Lynn Kiesecker. I'll give you his name, Lynn Kiesecker. And Lynn said, I have a theater I'm affiliated with right off Times Square. You can use it. So within a month, we would do our 3 services in the morning and then fly to New York City. And I did that for a year in the church has not only grown, it's now many, many congregations. I think there's 8 congregations now in the area. But I sat for 1 year every Sunday night with New Yorkers who had experienced tremendous devastation, either family members, friends they'd lost in that tragedy. And I could go down the line, whether it be in countries like the Philippines during the 80s, where there was a riots and revolution, and being in the middle of that for several weeks, talking to students, whether it's in London, in different times of crisis, whether it's in Africa. A pastor that actually was a pastor in Cape Town for a year at the University of Cape Town, primary location. And so sitting with people that had experienced racial and discrimination, deep injustice. And many times there were people who were religious who were propping that up. And that's the other quandary, is that you have suffering, that's this suffering of humanity, but then you see people that are religious who seem to be behind that suffering, whether it's pushing their own religious faith at the edge of a sword, or doing something that's harmful to somebody, and here they are supposed to be agents of love, and yet they're fostering pain. And Jesus spent a lot of time talking about, I just slapped this in case you want to underslap that. Jesus spent a lot of time talking about hypocrisy. And when he talked about hell, it's kind of like Dante's Inferno. The lowest level of hell was for those who were religious and were stumbling blocks or hypocrites. So there's a greater responsibility to reflect the love of God if you're a believer. So I don't enter this discussion lightly. All that to say, that's all preamble to say that there is an answer, that God has not created us as robots, that we are not animals, that we have moral choices that we make, and all of those moral choices have consequences. So God is the one who defines evil. He tells us what it is. He denounces it. He says, don't do it. And then he himself came to earth and suffered. So we don't have a God that's detached like the gods of the Greeks on Mount Olympus. We have a God who suffers, who took on our pain, who took on our suffering. The prophet Isaiah, that was the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was a new discovery that just a few weeks ago that was showing some amazing things, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the 1940s. But almost the entire book of Isaiah was discovered in the caves of Qumran outside of Jerusalem. I've been there many times. I used to live in Jerusalem, and right outside of the city, you go out the highway like you're going to Tel Aviv. You take a right, and you go down, and you can go up to the Sea of Galilee, or to the right to the Dead Sea. And right in those caves, a little boy threw a rock, broke some pottery, and they found these scrolls and almost the entire book of Isaiah. And in Isaiah chapter 53, it says that the prophet would say, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace fell upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. So the very stripes, the very punishment of Christ paid for our sins. So this is where we don't, as we mentioned, in the atheism doesn't take away the pain, it just takes away the hope. We have a God who has not only taken on our pain, but he's defeated it. And we have a promise that the pain will be healed, that we will have an eternity beyond this moment of life. So I think, and again, I'm a preacher, so I can really get this. I mean, this is, 5 minutes that could be expanded into a lot of talking on all the different aspects of this, but we do have a God who has suffered for us, who loves us, who is near to our suffering, and has peace and comfort for us, as well as a cry for justice in us to stop it, to see what we can do to stop injustice, to stop suffering. And that's why there's more of a question of, why is there good? We can say, well, why is there so much evil? Wait a minute, there's far more good collectively. For every person that shoots someone in a shooting spree, there are millions that would not do that. So the question is, why is there this restraint on the majority of people? That's the question that's even greater, is why does good exist? And no one maybe have asked that question, but I'll at least pose it there. So that was a long answer. I hope.
No, that was really great to think about.
I can't see anybody fidgeting, so the silence makes me think I can keep talking. So sorry about that.
No, that's really great to think about.
They'd be saying, "Oh, come on, Dad, hurry up." So that's it.
No, I really appreciated that, because also the like what you had mentioned about like just like, you know, in Isaiah and like this prophecy as well, it's really related to some of the questions that we had streaming in. For example, Burton was asking, if God exists, then how can you prove that it's the Christian God? And Burton was also mentioning about prophecies and how that could relate. So so I think that this actually kind of brings us into that next question quite nicely, if you want to add anything further to that.
Go ahead, Brian. I've talked too much.
What would you like me to expound upon specifically?
Why does this evidence point to the Christian God? You know, what is
So
how do you know it's the Christian God? I think that's the question in a sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So what happens is the scientific evidence narrows the field a lot, because you're dealing with a God who's transcendent, outside of time and space, separate from creation, but involved in the world. So that narrows it really to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Those are kind of the choices that you have. And again, the fact that the world demonstrates not just such evil and suffering, but the fact within all of us, there's this sense, almost a drive to do things that we don't want to do, which points to this sense that we've broken our relationship with the Creator. But then ultimately, if you want to go all the way, you have to expand the evidence, not just with the science, but with the history. Because again, if you look at the person of Jesus Christ, Jesus came to the earth saying that he represents God in the flesh, saying that he comes to present the truth. And he died and rose from the dead. And the historical evidence behind the resurrection is overwhelming if you're willing to consider the possibility. So it's a combination of the science with the history that, from more of an objective sense, points to Christianity. But beyond that, it's more our encounters with God. Because I remember I was pretty convinced God didn't exist. And I said, God, if you really exist, you have to prove it to me. And I experienced the supernatural power of God. I saw miracles. I experienced his love. So that's really the ultimate evidence. It's not just the external evidence, but it's a God who reaches out to us. Because what we have to remember is that God's not lost, we're lost. And what he's looking is for people that'll humble themselves and say, God, if you're real, I want to know, but I'll follow you. I will serve you. I will honor you. And I said, God, if you exist and you prove it to me, I will serve you with all of my heart. And a humble heart, God will respond to you. So if some of you out there are really wanting to know the truth, God will help you. But the first step is to surrender your will. It's to say, God, I'll let you define for me what's really true, and then he'll help you come to the truth. That's kind of the totality of the evidence.
You know, there's two parts to this. I'm going to just digress a minute on the question about prove. How do you prove something? And I think we really need to talk about what is proof. And we mentioned that a little bit in the seminar, but really proof, 100% proof of anything is impossible. I mean, we can go down into science does not depend on 100% proof of anything, simply because whether it's mathematics, whether it's the incompleteness theorem, Kurt Gödel, that, there's certain assumptions you have to have. If you're doing geometry, you have to start with axioms. So everything begins with a set of prior beliefs that you need to then build to do science. So the notion that I can stand up here and say I can prove beyond any possible doubt that something is true, I can't. Now I can prove, I believe I can give proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Is it possible that Jesus' resurrection didn't happen and that UFOs beamed the body of Jesus out of the tomb? Okay, it's possible, but is that reasonable? In a court of law, I come from a family of attorneys. I used to tell people we don't have family discussions, we have depositions. And you have to, in a court of law, you prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And I believe that when you look at the evidence of the existence, the existence of God, and we talked about that. We talked about the beginning of the universe. We talked about life, that life is information. That's what James Watson and Francis Crick, who discovered DNA. James Watson had a book called Life is Information. And then Francis Collins, who Veronica was featured in and Dr. Francis Collins, who's been the head of the NIH and led the Human Genome Project. You were featured in their magazine in BioLogos. So congratulations on that. But Dr. Francis Collins would have shown us back in the 90s that if you open up the genetic code, it's information. It's this 3 billion letter long sentence in human life. And I know there's different forms, different links, but I mean, you've got literally millions and millions, if not billions, this long sentence. So that information points to intelligence. And then we talked about morality, that good and evil are real. And so you have the moral law. Where does that come from? Is that our own just evolutionary instinct? Or is there something that points to a morality, as Lewis again would say, that we did not invent and that we know is true? It's something beyond us that's above us. But then finally, the Christian God, I believe the ultimate evidence is the fact that God became a man in Christ. I can't give you this book, and I'm not just trying to promote it. I would if you need it, but this is the second book I wrote in this series called Man, Myth, Messiah. And this was in the second God's Not Dead movie. There's a shameless product plug. If you ever watch that on Netflix, when the school teacher is being asked, she quoted a scripture in class, and they're mad at her for quoting the Bible in a secular setting, and they basically say, well, look, if Jesus was a real person, why couldn't you quote Jesus just like you would Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King? So the number one thing here is that Jesus existed. That's a fact. If you didn't have a Bible, Jesus Christ existed in history. We talk about the myths of, was Jesus just a recapitulation of Mithras or Osiris or all of these, or Horus, Krishna, all of these ancient gods? Do you have this mythological influence that somehow Christians borrowed mythology? And what you'll find in our document here is that really, no, that was the other way around, that other beliefs looked back and imitated the Christian story to try to rewrite their story ex post facto, after the fact. And then what's the evidence that he's the Messiah? And ultimately, it comes down to one simple event, the resurrection. That this God, this Jesus, was crucified in history. No one ever survived a Roman crucifixion. So Jesus died. Okay, this is not like in the old movie, The Princess Bride, where they go, is he dead? No, he's just mostly dead. No, he was totally dead. And so if you know he's dead, and then now he's seen alive, then you can't, there's no way that those are two irreconcilable facts. Someone who's dead, and now he's seen alive. And so Christianity starts in the very place where it would have been easiest to disprove, in Jerusalem, 3 days after that. And as I lived and worked in Jerusalem and still go regularly, especially, once COVID is lifting, I'll be back. But you never meet people there that deny Jesus existed. It all comes down to what happened, or either that he was crucified. That's a fact of history. But what happened to his body? Did his disciples steal it? Hide it in this? It's already a small city today, 2,000 years later. It was very small then. Did they hide it, and then did they go out and give their lives for something that they knew wasn't true? And that's why we said, that many people will die for what they believe to be true. Many people today die for their faith. That doesn't impress us. Sounds like a song. That don't impress me much. But no one dies for what they know to be false. And the majority of the disciples of Jesus would have died rather than deny the fact that he had been seen alive after his undeniable crucifixion and execution. So, Dr. Miller, anything to add to that?
No, that was beautiful. That was really beautiful. And again, what you find is that when you look at history, it gives this beautiful picture of how the New Testament authors were excellent historians. Like there was archaeologists that have looked at the Gospel of Luke, and they've looked at the book of Acts, which is a continuation of Luke, and they found countless archaeological pieces of evidence that point to the historicity of Luke. They look at how Luke described the leaders, the names, the customs, the boat journeys. So what's really significant about the Christian faith is that this is just not a philosophy. It's not a belief system that people just dreamed up, but it's rooted in reality. That if you apply the historical standards to the New Testament, you find there's some of the best historical documents from the ancient world. But beyond that, the truth written in the Gospels, if you live it out, if you follow it, if you turn to God, you experience the promises that are there. It's this reality that God proves himself to us day after day, that solidifies our faith also. So that, again, that combination of evidence and experience is what's so overwhelming about the Christian faith.
I love that. There were some comments people were talking about experience, and I love that you guys are also mentioning your experiences as well, because that is part of our reality. Just kind of getting back to going back about Jesus as well. We had a couple questions specifically about the evidence outside of the Bible that Jesus actually existed, and it sounds like you did cover a bit of it, but was there anything else that you wanted to kind of just make clear in case that person who was asking might want to hear a little more? Or
well, if you had that question about that, just put that in the comments and I'll send you this book instead of the God's Not Dead book. I'll just do that if that's your question. Even though in God's Not Dead, I do have a chapter on Jesus, but this is an entire book on the subject. And it was a joy to write this book. It was a joy to research and to talk to historians. And I think, there's a difference in somebody that is blogging in their parents' basement versus a real somebody that is using the laws of historiography. And when you're an historian, you realize the importance of, just a few sources. I mean, when you go back and look in history and say, how do we know anything was what we have been told, from several thousand years ago or hundreds of years ago? I mean, people today are talking about conspiracy theorists doubting everything, doubting things that happened, in the last several decades, much less 2,000 years ago. But the other thing is, when we realize how old the earth is, this is another thought. Again, I'm not trying to not deal with this, but I just, for the sake of time, I've got the documentations, the footnotes. So if you're interested in that question of what are the extra biblical sources, then I'll be glad to send you that. So, but here's just a little thought, because people say, 2,000 years ago, in the Bible, let's say let's say the book of Matthew, let's say Jesus died, let's say 30 AD. Round number, around there, 30 AD. So the book of Mark, that was the first gospel. That was written in earliest sources I've heard are, like early 50s. Let's just say 25 years after the fact. Then Matthew and Luke, probably in the late 60s, because none of them mentioned the destruction of Jerusalem, which was in 70 AD. That's a fact. Titus, the Roman general, came in and leveled the temple. That's an historical fact. Jesus predicted that, but that's not mentioned in either Luke or Matthew. And then in John mentions, John was written after that, in the 80s or 90s. So let's just take the book of John, say from 30 to 90, 60 years. And we think, in 60 years, that's just so long ago. That's just, they could have. My father, I mentioned this in this book, that my father was in World War II. He was in a submarine called the USS Barb, and his older brother was a Marine and was killed on the island of Saipan. Suicide bomber jumped into the bunker and they were all killed. My father's commander of the USS Barb took the submarine to the island of Saipan, and my father and a group of volunteers, while the island was under combat, made their way through the island to find the grave so that they could mark it and have it exhumed, the body exhumed, and have a burial in the United States. When my dad was in his late 80s, 60 years, 65 years after the fact of World War II, there was no dimming of his memory that, number one, there was a war, and number two, of his brother's death and the events that surrounded his own brother's death 65 years later, because it was the memory of something that traumatic and that overwhelming to your life and how it affected you could not have been dismissed or just, hey, it's like, what happened 2 years ago at Christmas. So really, you're talking about within the first century, these gospel writers wrote, and that's why we accept the gospels we have and not later gospels of Thomas, gospels of Judas. These are gospels that were written after in the second and third centuries and beyond. but these were first century accounts when those who would have been alive, who would have experienced this, would have been there as their audience. And so I think that when you look at the laws of historiography, or how when I say laws, when you look at the principles of historiography, we can have great confidence that what we have now in terms of the Bible is what they wrote then. What we have now, and I'm borrowing this phrase from Dr. Dan Wallace, who is a textual critic. He would say he believes that what we have now, when I say critic, that means he's looking at it not just critically to say what is the real scripture and what is spurious. What we have now is what they wrote then.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. That also covered another question about just talking about the reliability of the Bible. And so yeah, I also think that question was being covered, just getting into the historiography. I'm a scientist, but historiography sounds pretty cool. I'm not changing majors now.
In the book, there's a whole chapter on the reliability of scripture in both of these. This is more of the reliability of the Gospels, but when you get the God's Not Dead book, I think it's chapter 8. It's been a while since I've actually read my own book. Yes, I think it is chapter 8. Yeah, the witness of scripture. And this goes through why I believe the Bible can be trusted.
Awesome.
Pointing the evidence to that. So when you get that, that's there to look at.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to just ask one more question. It's a little bundle question from two questions at once, but they're quite similar. But just asking, and just to reiterate, so what makes Jesus unique, and how can you say that Christianity is the only right way? And I think that'll be a good way to wrap up as well, if you don't mind.
You have the last word, Dr. Miller.
Well, what's unique is that you have philosophical systems where you have leaders like Socrates or Plato. You've got religious systems. You may have like Muhammad. But Jesus is unique in that he claimed to be the very image of God on earth, that he was the very presence of God, and that's distinct. And what's unique is about his life. If you look at, he lived a life of just extraordinary ethical purity. Even critics would acknowledge that. He demonstrated the supernatural power of God in extraordinary ways of controlling the weather, of casting out spiritual forces, of multiplying food. And then he rose from the dead. And that's obviously unique. No one else has ever done that. And his authority, and this is another thing that's really powerful, is that Jesus said, my sheep will know his voice. And when you hear the words of Jesus, it's that power where it's the very voice of God transforming your heart, which was my experience when I was finishing high school. That's unique about who he is. No one else has made comparable claims, done comparable miracles, or proved his truth through rising from the dead.
I want to just say, I promised you the last word, but I'm going to take that back. I just want to ask how many of you have made that step? I know for me, as a college student, it happened to you, Brian, as a college student, that I had enough evidence to not take a leap of faith, but to take a step of trust. A leap of faith is just blind, just going into oblivion and saying, I'm just going to throw myself out here to whatever God is out there, catch me, versus following the evidence where it leads. And I think that this is what our hope would be for you tonight, that you would take a step and just simply say, just in your room there, you don't have to do it now, but when you turn this off, to say, God, I believe you're real. And I believe that you came to the earth as Jesus Christ. You died for my sin. You died for my guilt. You died for my shame. And you died that I might be not only forgiven, but that I might have your purpose and might have your spirit and your power in my life. One of the first Bible verses that I learned was in the book of 2 Timothy, which is a letter from the Apostle Paul to his apprentice named Timothy, kind of like Obi-Wan writing to Luke Skywalker. But he said, God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. When our minds begin to go haywire, we begin to have so much fear and confusion and anxiety, the confidence that God is in me, that he's there. It's like when my father in the submarine, he used to tell me, he said, no matter what pressure we were under in that submarine as long as the pressure inside the sub was greater than the pressure outside the sub, we were okay. And so if we don't have something inside of us, we can crumble like an aluminum can. But when the Spirit of God comes, as you invite him into your life and as you turn to him in faith and say, I believe this simple message, that you died for my sins, that you loved me. For God so loved the world, the scripture says, that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And that life is not just dying and going and sitting on a cloud, but it's an everlasting power that comes to live inside of us. And that came into my life over 40 years ago, and it's not left. And it took me from confused, fearful, you name it, depressed. It didn't, wasn't this instant, now I'm just this goofy, smiley, got this, like the Joker, I've got a smile on my face all the time. No, it wasn't that. It was a sense that God had done something in my spirit, in my heart. And as you just reach out to him, it says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Whoever calls on the name of Jesus. And that's why the uniqueness of Christianity, the question that was asked, why do you believe that Christianity is unique or is the way to salvation? And it's a very simple answer: the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The Bible itself says that if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So Christianity is the only religion that bases the weight of its truth on that one event, on any single event, but specifically Christianity says that event. But no other religion says if this one thing is true or false, then the whole thing falls if it's false. But Christianity says if Christ has not been raised, the whole thing is false. It's not just a good philosophy of life. It's not just Jesus was a good moral teacher. He was, as C.S. Lewis said, he was either a liar because he knew he wasn't the Son of God. He was either a lunatic because he thought he was the Son of God, or he was the Lord. He is the Son of God, the creator of the universe. So I hope if you pray that prayer, let us know, or if you just pray it later and just want to talk to us more. Thank you for those of you that have remained on to the end here. Thank you so much. It's been my privilege. I know I speak, Dr. Miller, I know how much we've been doing this together for at least a decade, maybe longer, all over the world. So we never get tired of it. It's a joy.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be talking with you and to you in the audience.